I was folding laundry when my phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen, and for a split second, I thought he was calling to tell me when the funeral would be. Instead, his voice was cold, professional, final. "We all agreed," he said. "You are not welcome at your grandfather's funeral." I opened my mouth to speak, to ask why, to remind him that I was still his daughter, still my grandfather's granddaughter, but the line went dead. He hung up without another word. I stood there, frozen, my hands shaking, the silence roaring in my ears. My grandfather was gone. William Reynolds, the billionaire everyone admired, the only person in my family who ever truly protected me, and I wasn't allowed to say goodbye. At that moment, I thought the pain couldn't get any worse. I was wrong. Because a few days later, after I accidentally dropped an old family photo frame, I found something hidden behind the glass, a final letter from my grandfather. And that letter would change everything, and make my entire family panic. People always assumed I was lucky. They heard my last name Reynolds and immediately imagined privilege, protection, and unconditional support. They imagined a grandfather who built $1 billion empire, a father who ran it with confidence, and a family that stood together like an unbreakable wall. The truth was far quieter, and far colder. I grew up in large houses where every room echoed, not because of space, but because no one lingered long enough to fill it with warmth. The walls were lined with art worth more than most people's homes, yet the air always felt tense, as if one wrong word could trigger something unseen. My father, Richard Reynolds, ruled both the company and the household the same way, through control. He believed respect came from fear, and that love made people weak. Praise was rare, criticism was constant. Every achievement was met with a single question: was that the best you could do? I learned to measure my worth by his silence. My Aunt Linda, the family's financial genius, never raised her voice, but her disapproval was sharp and precise. She spoke to me the way she reviewed reports, quickly, efficiently, without interest in anything that didn't produce value. I could feel her assessing me every time I entered a room, as if deciding whether I was an asset or a liability. My Uncle Mark treated family interactions like business deals. He remembered birthdays only if it benefited him. Compliments always came with conditions. Conversations felt like negotiations where I had nothing to offer. Family gatherings weren't loud or chaotic. They were polished, controlled. Everyone smiled, but no one relaxed. We didn't argue, we maneuvered. We didn't comfort, we observed. And I learned early that emotions were things you kept to yourself. I adapted. I became careful, polite, easy to ignore. The only person who ever broke through that silence was my grandfather. William Reynolds was different from the rest of them in ways that were impossible to miss. He didn't dominate conversations. He didn't test people. He asked questions and waited for the answers. When I was 16 and my father told me I was too sensitive to survive in the Reynolds world, I locked myself in the guest bathroom and cried until my chest hurt. My grandfather was the one who knocked softly on the door. "Sophia," he said. Not impatient, not angry, just worried. Later, sitting beside me on the back patio, he told me something I never forgot. "This family mistakes hardness for strength," he said quietly. "Don't make that mistake." He was the only one who never tried to shape me into something else. He didn't push me toward the company. He didn't talk about legacy like it was a weapon. He asked what made me feel alive. He listened when I spoke, and somehow, that made all the difference. As I grew older, the distance between me and the rest of the family became permanent. I chose a quieter path. I built a life that felt honest. I married Ethan, who loved me without conditions, without tests. I stayed respectful toward my family, but distant. Still, part of me believed that blood meant something. That no matter how strained things were, no matter how little space I took up in their world, there were moments when family lines could not be crossed. I believed that death was one of those moments. I believed that when my grandfather passed away, I would be allowed to mourn him like a granddaughter. I didn't know then how wrong I was. Because when my father told me I was not welcome at the funeral, it didn't just break my heart. It finally revealed the truth I had been avoiding my entire life. I had never truly belonged to the Reynolds family. I had simply been tolerated until I wasn't even that anymore. I didn't find out my grandfather had died from my family. That alone should have told me everything. It was Claire, my oldest friend, who called me early that morning. Her voice was hesitant, careful, like someone walking across thin ice. "Sophia, I didn't know how else to say this," she whispered. "I just saw the announcement. Your grandfather passed away last night." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The room blurred around me. The mug in my hand slipped slightly, hot coffee spilling onto the counter, but I didn't feel it. All I could think was that this couldn't be real. I had spoken to him just days earlier. His voice had been weaker, yes, but still warm. Still him. "I was going to visit him next week," I said, more to myself than to Claire. "He promised we'd talk." He always did. After I hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the wall, waiting for my phone to ring again. Waiting for my father, for my aunt, for anyone in my family to say, "We're sorry, we're coming together. You should come home." Nothing. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking as I dialed my father's number. It rang longer than usual before he answered. "What is it, Sophia?" he said, his tone clipped, impatient as if I were interrupting a meeting. "I just heard about Grandpa," I said carefully. "Is it true?" There was a pause. Not the kind filled with grief, but the kind filled with calculation. "Yes," he replied. He passed peacefully. I swallowed. "When is the funeral?" Another pause. Longer this time. "That's why I'm calling," he said, his voice suddenly distant. "We've discussed this as a family." A chill ran through me. "Discussed what?" "We all agreed," my father said flatly. "You are not welcome at the funeral." I laughed once because the words didn't make sense. "What are you talking about?" "He was my grandfather. This is not a negotiation," he snapped. "You made your choices. You walked away from this family. Don't complicate things now." "I didn't walk away from him," I said, my voice breaking. "I loved him. He loved me. You can't take this from me." "You're being emotional," he replied coldly. "This is exactly why we made this decision." "Dad." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, waiting for it to light up again, waiting for him to call back, to say he didn't mean it, that he'd spoken too harshly, that of course I could come. He never did. I tried calling my Aunt Linda. No answer. I texted my Uncle Mark, left on read. I even reached out to the family assistant, someone who had watched me grow up only to receive a stiff reply. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I'm just following instructions." Instructions. That was the word that shattered me. By nightfall, the reality had sunk in. My family wasn't grieving together. They were closing ranks, and I was on the outside. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the suitcase I had already begun packing out of instinct. Ethan sat beside me, his hand resting gently on my back. "They can't do this," he said quietly. "You should be there." "I know," I whispered. "But they don't care what's right. They care about control." For the first time, I felt something shift inside me, not just grief, but fear. Because if they were willing to erase me from my grandfather's funeral, what else were they willing to erase? The day of the funeral arrived without warning. No black dress laid out on my bed. No itinerary. No address. Just a quiet morning that felt wrong in every possible way. The world outside my window carried on as if nothing had happened, and that hurt more than I expected. I knew exactly what was happening miles away. The grand hall. The polished marble floors. The long line of black cars pulling up to the estate. I could picture my family standing together, accepting condolences, speaking in low, respectful tones. I wondered if my grandfather's name was spoken with genuine sorrow or with relief. I made coffee I didn't drink and turned on the television, then turned it off again. Every sound felt too loud. Every silence felt unbearable. Ethan asked if I wanted company. I shook my head. "I need to be alone," I said. "Just for today." He hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be right here if you need me." After he left the room, I wandered through the apartment without purpose. My fingers traced the edges of bookshelves, picture frames, small reminders of a life built quietly and honestly far away from the Reynolds estate. That's when my eyes landed on the old family photo frame. It sat on the lowest shelf, slightly crooked, something I'd brought with me years ago when I moved out for good. The photo inside was from a summer long ago, taken on the back lawn of my grandfather's house. He stood in the center, tall and smiling, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I remembered that day clearly. He'd pulled me aside afterward and said, "Keep this. One day it will remind you who you are." My throat tightened. I reached for the frame, meaning only to straighten it, but my fingers slipped. The frame hit the floor with a sharp crack. Glass shattered. I gasped and knelt down immediately, my heart pounding as if I'd done something unforgivable. "I'm sorry," I whispered instinctively, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. As I gathered the broken pieces, I noticed something strange. The backing of the frame wasn't flat. There was a slight bulge, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. My hands froze. Slowly, carefully, I peeled the cardboard backing away. A folded piece of paper slid out. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my breath shallow, my thoughts racing. The paper was yellowed at the edges, creased as if it had been opened and closed many times. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandfather's. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The room felt suddenly too small, too quiet, as if the walls themselves were listening. The first line stole the air from my lungs. "Sophia, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here and something has gone very wrong." I sank onto the floor, the letter shaking in my hands. As I read on, my grief shifted into something sharper. My grandfather wrote about his fears, about being pressured, about decisions made on his behalf. He wrote that he trusted me not because of blood, but because I had always chosen integrity over ambition. Near the end, one sentence stood out, underlined twice. "If my wishes are ever questioned, this letter is proof that I did not consent." Tears blurred the page. In that moment, everything changed. My family hadn't just shut me out of the funeral. They were hiding something, and my grandfather had known they would. I folded the letter slowly, my hands steady now, my heart pounding with a new understanding. This wasn't just about saying goodbye anymore. This was about the truth. And I was the only one holding it. I didn't tell anyone about the letter that night. Not Ethan, not Claire, not even myself, not fully. I placed it back on the table, smoothed the creases with trembling fingers, and stared at it as if it might disappear if I looked away for too long. My grandfather had known. That thought echoed in my head again and again. He had known they would try to silence me. He had known they would shut me out, isolate me, make me doubt my place in the family, and somehow, quietly, without confrontation, he had prepared for this moment. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my father's voice again. We all agreed. I wondered when that agreement had been made, around which table, in which room I was never invited into. The next morning, my phone rang. I froze. It was my Aunt Linda. She hadn't called me directly in years. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hello? Sophia," she said, her tone unusually soft. "I heard you've been having a difficult time." I almost laughed. "You mean after being told I wasn't welcome at my own grandfather's funeral?" I asked. A pause, then a controlled sigh. "We didn't want to upset you. You didn't want me there," I replied. "There's a difference." She ignored that. "Your grandfather's passing has been very stressful for all of us. Emotions are high. Decisions were made quickly." "Decisions about me," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "Listen," she continued. "It's best for everyone if things stay settled. The estate is being handled. The will is clear. There's no reason to create unnecessary conflict." My grip tightened around the phone. "I haven't created anything. I'm just asking you to be reasonable," she said gently, but there was something sharp underneath her words. "You've built your own life. You don't need to be involved in this." I looked at the letter on the table. "I think my grandfather wanted me involved," I said quietly. Her voice cooled instantly. "Did he tell you that?" "No," I answered. "He wrote it." Silence. I could almost hear her calculating on the other end of the line. "Well," she said slowly, "whatever you believe you have, I strongly suggest you speak to a professional before making assumptions." "I plan to," I replied. She hung up without saying goodbye. That was when the messages started. My Uncle Mark texted, "Let this go. You don't want problems." A family lawyer I barely remembered emailed, offering to clarify the will if I had questions privately. Even an old family friend reached out, reminding me how fragile reputations can be. They weren't shouting. They didn't have to. Their message was clear. Stay quiet. Or else. Ethan watched me pace the living room, the letter clutched in my hand. "They're scared," he said calmly. They're powerful, I replied. And I'm just me. He took the letter from my hands and read it slowly. When he finished, his jaw tightened. You're not just anything. And this isn't about money. This is about your grandfather's voice being heard. I know kings that. That night I made a decision I had avoided my entire life. I stopped trying to keep the peace. The next morning, I scheduled a consultation with an independent attorney, someone with no ties to my family, no reason to protect their image. Her name was Rachel Moore. As I sat in her office, sunlight pouring through the window, I finally unfolded the letter and placed it on her desk. Rachel read it carefully, her expression shifting from neutral to intent. This, she said, tapping the page gently, is not just a letter of grief, it's a warning. I swallowed. So, I'm not imagining this? No, she replied firmly. And if your family is urging you to stay silent, that tells me everything I need to know. For the first time since my grandfather died, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt clarity. Whatever came next, pressure, threats, isolation, I wasn't alone anymore. And I wasn't backing down. Once I hired Rachel, the tone of everything changed. Not immediately. Not dramatically. At first, it was too subtle to be coincidence. The calls stopped. For 2 full days, my phone stayed silent. No messages from my aunt. No warnings from distant relatives. No polite reminders to be reasonable. It felt like the calm before a storm, and that unsettled me more than the threats ever had. Rachel noticed it too. They're regrouping, she said during our second meeting. Powerful families don't react emotionally. They react strategically. I nodded, my fingers interlaced so tightly they hurt. What happens next? They'll try to control the narrative, she replied. And if that doesn't work, they'll try to control you. I can state it, advocate. She asked permission to contact the probate court and request copies of the official will and estate filings. I agreed, my heart pounding as if I'd just crossed an invisible line. That evening, my father called. I stared at his name on the screen for a long time before answering. Sophia, he said, his voice measured, almost calm. We need to talk. We've talked, I replied. You told me I wasn't welcome to say goodbye to my grandfather. That wasn't personal, he said quickly. It was about stability. Stability for who? I asked. He ignored the question. I hear you've hired an attorney. Yes. A sharp exhale. That's unnecessary. So, was banning me from the funeral, I said. His patience cracked. You're making a serious mistake. I closed my eyes. Then, explain why. Another pause. I could almost hear him choosing his words carefully. The company, the estate, the reputation of this family, these things are fragile right now. If you push this, you could damage more than you realize. You mean, you, I said quietly. His voice hardened. I mean everyone. When I didn't respond, he continued, lower now. You don't have the resources to fight us. You don't have the influence. And dragging this into court will only isolate you further. I thought of the letter. Of my grandfather's handwriting. Of the way he'd looked at me the last time we spoke, as if he were trying to memorize my face. I'm already isolated, I said. You made sure of that. He ended the call without another word. The next day, Rachel forwarded me an email from the family's legal team. It was polished, courteous, carefully worded. They suggested mediation. They questioned the authenticity of any personal correspondence. They warned that false claims could lead to legal consequences. Rachel read it once, then looked at me. They're testing you. Testing what? I asked. Whether you'll flinch. I didn't. Instead, I handed her the letter again. This time, she studied it not as a document but as evidence. We'll verify the handwriting, she said. We'll request a forensic review. And we'll file a formal motion to pause estate distribution until this is resolved. My stomach twisted. They won't like that. No, she said evenly. They'll panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the apartment made my heart race. Every unknown number felt like a warning. I wasn't being followed. No one showed up at my door. But the pressure was everywhere in the air, in the pauses between messages, in the sudden friendliness of people who had ignored me for years. Ethan held my hand as I stared at the ceiling. You can stop, he said gently. No one would blame you. I turned to him. My grandfather trusted me with the truth. He nodded. Then, see it through. The following morning, Rachel filed the motion, and within hours, my phone exploded. Calls, messages, voicemails. My family wasn't asking me to be quiet anymore. They were demanding it. And that was when I knew I was closer to the truth than they ever expected. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Rachel insisted we arrive early. This isn't just a discussion, she said as we walked through the marble lobby of the downtown office building. This is a power play. They're expecting you to hesitate. I didn't hesitate. The conference room was exactly how I remembered it. Long glass table, floor-to-ceiling windows, city skyline reflected on polished surfaces. It was the kind of room designed to make people feel small. My father was already there. Richard Reynolds sat at the head of the table, hands folded, expression carefully neutral. To his right was my Aunt Linda, impeccably dressed, her face unreadable. My Uncle Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me like a problem he hadn't decided how to solve yet. The family's legal team filled the remaining seats. No one stood when I entered. Rachel pulled out a chair for me and whispered, "Look straight ahead." I did. My father spoke first. "Let's get this over with." "Gladly," Rachel replied before I could. "We're here to formally address concerns regarding the validity of William Reynolds' will." Linda's lips tightened. "There are no concerns." Rachel slid a folder across the table. "Actually, there are several." I felt every eye turn toward me. My father finally looked directly at me, and for the first time since the phone call, his composure cracked. "You're really doing this," he said quietly. After everything you did," I replied. Mark scoffed. "You weren't even there at the end." "That's because you made sure of it," I said, my voice steady even as my chest burned. Linda leaned forward. "Sophia, stop this now. You don't understand the damage you're causing." Rachel met her gaze. "My client understands perfectly. That's why we're proceeding. His stone was at Master." She turned to me. "Would you like to explain why we're here?" I took a breath. "I found a letter," I said, "written by my grandfather, hidden behind a photo frame he gave me." Silence fell over the room. Linda's fingers twitched. "That letter," I continued, "states clearly that my grandfather feared being pressured, that he did not consent to certain decisions being made on his behalf." My father stood abruptly. "That letter means nothing." Rachel raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Reynolds." "He didn't." "You think a piece of paper gives you the right to dismantle this family?" he snapped. "To drag our name through courtrooms and headlines?" "I think the truth does," I said. Linda's voice sharpened. "Do you have any idea what happens if this goes public?" "Yes," I replied. "And I'm willing to accept it." Mark shook his head. "You always wanted to be different. Congratulations. You've gone too far." Rachel opened her laptop. "We've already filed a motion with the court to pause estate distribution pending forensic verification of the letter." That was when the room changed. My father's face went pale. Linda stood slowly, gripping the back of her chair. "You can't do that." "We already did," Rachel said calmly. "For the first time, I saw fear, not anger, not arrogance, fear." "You think you're protecting his legacy?" my father said, his voice low, dangerous. "You're destroying it." I met his eyes. "You destroyed it the moment you decided I didn't deserve to say goodbye." No one spoke. Rachel closed her laptop. "From this point forward, all communication goes through legal counsel. Any attempts to intimidate my client will be documented. I do stake in his airy stay." As we stood to leave, Linda finally spoke again, her voice trembling despite herself. "Sophia. Please. We can fix this." Privately, I turned back. "No," I said softly. "You had your chance." We walked out together, me and Rachel, leaving them behind in that glass room full of reflections and lies. Outside, my knees nearly gave out. Rachel steadied me. "You did exactly what you needed to do." I looked back at the building, my heart racing, my hands shaking. I had just stood up to my entire family. And for the first time since my grandfather died, I felt something close to relief. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the moment everything began to fall apart. The fallout was immediate. Within 24 hours of that meeting, Rachel received confirmation from the probate court. The distribution of my grandfather's estate was officially paused. An independent forensic team would verify the handwriting and timeline of the letter, and all involved parties were ordered to preserve records and communications. For the first time since my grandfather died, the process was no longer controlled by my family. It was controlled by the law. My phone didn't stop buzzing. Messages came from numbers I hadn't seen in years. Distant relatives, former assistants, even people who had once dismissed me as irrelevant. Most of them said the same thing. "We didn't know. We're sorry. You're brave." Some reached out not with sympathy, but with curiosity, trying to sense which way the wind was blowing. I answered none of them. I had learned the cost of trusting too easily. My father didn't call. Instead, his attorneys did. They requested delays. They objected to procedures. They challenged the scope of the investigation. Each move felt less like confidence and more like desperation. Rachel remained calm through it all. "This is what happens when control slips," she told me during one of our late-night calls. "They're reacting, not planning." The forensic report arrived 2 weeks later. Rachel called me into her office and closed the door before speaking. "The handwriting matches," she said simply. "The letter is authentic." I sat down hard, my breath leaving me all at once. "He really wrote it," I whispered. "Yes," she replied. "And more than that, there's evidence he drafted it weeks before his health declined." This wasn't confusion, it was intention. That confirmation changed everything. The court ordered a full review of the original will. Certain clauses were flagged. Decisions once treated as unquestionable were suddenly under scrutiny. My family's united front fractured almost overnight. Mark resigned from any involvement, claiming he wanted distance from the conflict. Linda stopped appearing in public altogether, and my father, once so confident, so untouchable, became a name whispered rather than praised. I didn't celebrate. I mourned. Because even as the truth surfaced, what it revealed was devastating. Not just about money or control, but about how easily people could justify silencing someone they claimed to love. One evening, my father finally reached out, not with anger, but exhaustion. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly over the phone. "I didn't have a choice," I replied. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. We ended the call in silence, and I knew there would never be a resolution between us. But I had one with my grandfather. Weeks later, the court formally acknowledged the letter as part of the estate record. My grandfather's wishes, once hidden behind glass, were now undeniable. Rachel smiled when she told me, "Your voice is officially on record." As I left her office that day, sunlight warming my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, closure. In the end, nothing looked the way I once imagined it would. There was no public apology, no dramatic reconciliation, no moment where my family suddenly understood the damage they had caused. And strangely enough, I didn't need any of that to move on. What I needed was truth. The court process continued quietly, methodically, the way justice is meant to work, not fueled by emotion, but by facts. My grandfather's letter remained part of the official record, his words protected by the law rather than buried by fear. That alone felt like a promise kept. I chose not to fight for power or recognition. I didn't ask to be placed at the center of anything. What mattered to me was that my grandfather's voice was no longer silenced, and that I had finally learned to protect my own. My relationship with my family changed permanently. I set boundaries where I once begged for understanding. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. Distance, I learned, is not cruelty, it is self-respect. Ethan stood by me through every step, steady when I wavered, calm when the pressure felt unbearable. With him, I built a life defined not by legacy or expectations, but by honesty and safety. That became my real inheritance. Sometimes I still look at the photo frame, the glass replaced, the letter carefully preserved elsewhere. I imagine my grandfather watching quietly, knowing I finally did what he hoped I would. I didn't save a family empire, I saved myself. And that, I've learned, is more than enough.